Hey everyone, it's Matt, and welcome to another episode of Commander Adventures. This week, we have a great game lined up for all of you. First off, we have Brian, keeping watch over everything with Izoni, Thousand Eyed. His deck focuses on dredging cards like crazy, and ultimately recurring threats to the battlefield to wear down his opponents. We then have Caitlin, controlling things from the shadows alongside Kethis the Hidden Hand. It's a Legends Matter deck, which focuses on controlling the game just long enough to finish things off with a combo. Carissa is here, gearing up to defend with Sigarda, Host of Herons. This is an Aura and Equipment deck, which focuses on quickly pumping Sigarda and closing out the game with commander damage. Last but certainly not least, we have Chris, piloting the new Alela Artful Provocateur. This deck combines artifacts and enchantments to create a fairy storm, which he then pumps up to close out the game. Let's get into it. Brian starts us off. He drops a Llanowar Wastes, and passes. Caitlin drops a forest. Carissa drops a forest, and then casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Chris shocks in a Hallowed Fountain, and uses it to cast a Soul Ring. Brian drops a forest, and casts a Talisman of Resilience. Caitlin drops a Swamp. Carissa drops a Plains, and casts a Land Tax. On his upkeep, Chris casts an Enlightened Tutor. He puts a Bitter Blossom on top of his library, and then draws it for turn. He then drops a Concealed Courtyard, and casts the Bitter Blossom. Brian drops a Forest. He casts a Reclamation Sage, and reclaims Bitter Blossom as it enters. Caitlin drops a Swamp. Without a Plains, she passes off. Carissa triggers Land Tax on her upkeep, and goes to grab 3 basics. She plays a Plains, and follows it up with a Cultivate, bringing in a Forest tapped, and Chris untaps as she brings a Forest to hand. Chris casts the Smothering Tithe, and then follows it up with a tapped Arcane Sanctum before passing. Brian chooses not to pay for his draw, and Chris gets a treasure. He drops a Cavern of Souls naming Elf. He then pings himself with Llanowar Wastes, and sacrifices Reclamation Sage to cast a Diabolic Intent. Finally, he pings himself again to cast the Stinkweed Imp he tutored up. Caitlin chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe, and Chris creates a treasure. She casts a Reki the History of Kamigawa, and comments on how it'll probably do Chris more good than her with Smothering Tithe in play. Carissa chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe. She drops a Temple of the False God, and brings out her commander Sigarda. She enchants her with a Hyena Umbra, and passes. Chris floats a mana, and then casts his commander Alela. He cracks a Misty Rainforest to shock in a Watery Grave. He then follows up by casting a Thran Dynamo. Alela creates a fairy, and Chris passes. Brian pays for his draw. He drops a High Market, and then takes 2 to cast an Ayara, uncounterable thanks to Cavern of Souls. As it ETBs, he gains a life, and pings each opponent for 1 as well. Caitlin chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe. She casts a Salvager of Ruin, and passes. Carissa chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe. She then drops a Plains, and follows up by casting a 3 Dreams. She grabs a Bear Umbra, Unquestioned Authority, and Unflinching Courage, and puts them all to hand. She then follows up with a Soul Ring, and enchants Sigarda with Unflinching Courage. She moves to combat, and hits Brian for 8 commander damage. She gains 8 from lifelink, and passes to Chris. Chris drops an Azorius Guildgate. He moves to combat, and hits Carissa for 2 commander damage, gaining 2 from lifelink as well. He then passes turn. At his end step, Brian sacrifices Stinkweed Imp to High Market to gain a life. In place of his draw, Brian dredges back Stinkweed Imp. He plays a Dark Depths, and then pings himself for 1 to recast Stinkweed. Ayara triggers, and pings his opponents while he gains 1. Caitlin chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe. She drops a tapped Dackmore Salvage, and passes turn. Carissa chooses not to pay for Smothering Tithe. She drops a Forest, and casts a Bear Umbra enchanting Sigarda. She follows it up with an Unquestioned Authority, and draws a card as it enters. She can't pay, so Chris gets a treasure. She casts a Sage's Reverie, and draws 4. Once again, she can't pay for Smothering Tithe, so Chris gets 4 more treasures. Carissa then moves to combat, and swings Sigarda at Brian for 15. In response to declaration of attackers, Chris casts a Cryptic Command. He chooses to bounce Sage's Reverie, and draw a card, and then Brian takes 10 commander damage, as Carissa gains 10 and untaps all of her lands. In main 2, she casts a Mirari's Wake, and then moves to resolve a privileged position. In response, Chris cracks 2 treasures to counterspell it. Chris casts a Contamination. He creates a Fairy from Alela, and now all lands only produce 1 black mana. He drops a Fabled Passage, and passes. At his end step, Brian sacrifices Stinkweed Imp to activate a Yara, and then replaces her draw by dredging the Imp back to hand. Regaining priority, Chris cracks his Fabled Passage. Brian doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. He drops a Woodland Cemetery, and Chris brings in a Plains from Fabled Passage. Brian then casts a Rune-Scarred Demon, and pings everyone with a Yara, and gains another life as it enters. He then goes to tutor up a card. Caitlin does not pay for Smothering Tithe. She misses another land drop, and casts a Karn the Great Creator to avoid discarding down. She upticks him, and chooses not to target anything. She then remembers her draw from Reki, and Chris gets a treasure since she can't pay. Still not hitting a land, she passes. Carissa chooses not to pay for her draw. She drops a Forest, and casts a Blackblade Reforged. She then remembers she can't equip it to Sigarda due to Karn, and moves to combat. She hits Chris for 11 commander damage, gains 11 from lifelink, and untaps her lands before passing turn. Chris sacrifices Contamination on his upkeep. He casts a Demonic Tutor, and goes to grab a card. He then moves to combat, and swings 6 at Karn. Karn is removed, and he passes turn. At end step, Brian sacks Rune-Scarred Demon to a Yara, and draws as Chris gets a treasure. Brian doesn't pay again, and Chris gets both of his treasures as Brian drops an Emergence Zone. He then recasts Stinkweed Imp. Caitlin does not pay for Smothering Tithe. She finally gets a white source through Avacyn's Pilgrim, and then casts the Death Side of Life and Death. She returns the Revel Arc she had to discard last turn, and loses 5 life. Carissa does not pay for her draw. She drops a Canopy Vista, and follows up by casting a True Conviction. She equips Sigarda with Blackblade, and swings her at Chris. Chris responds by casting an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. With the Rift on the stack, Brian sacrifices Stinkweed to a Yara, and dredges her draw. Cyclonic Rift then resolves, and because of the timing Chris used, Carissa still gets to untap her lands from Bear Umbra. In main 2, Carissa begins to rebuild. She starts off with Soul Ring, and then recast Blackblade Reforged. We then see Mirari's Wake, and Sigarda both hit again. Avacyn's Pilgrim follows up, and then she discards land tax at end step. Chris drops a Temple of Deceit, and scries a card to the bottom of his library. Now hellbent, he passes turn. Brian chooses not to pay for his draw, and then drops a Bloodstained Mire as Chris creates his treasure. Brian then cracks the fetch, and loses a life to bring in a swamp. He closes out his turn by recasting Stinkweed Imp. Caitlin gives Chris a treasure. She then casts a Putrid Imp. She recasts Staveson's Pilgrim, and passes after discarding down. Carissa does not pay for her draw. She then drops a Rogue's Passage. She recast Bear Umbra, Unflinching Courage, and Unquestioned Authority, all enchanting Sigarda. She draws as Unquestioned Authority enters, True Conviction hits again, and before she goes to combat, Brian cracks Emergent Zone to give his spells flash, and flashes in a Toxic Deluge, paying 12 life to wipe the board. Chris recasts Alela. He follows up with a Glenelendra Liege, and passes. Brian dredges back Stinkweed Imp in place of his draw. He casts an Hour of Promise, and goes to grab a tapped Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Cabal Coffers. He recasts Talisman of Resilience, and passes. Caitlin chooses not to pay for her draw. She drops Poison Tipped Archer. Carissa doesn't pay for her draw. She drops a Forest, and recasts Sigarda. She casts a Sword of the Animist, and pays to equip both it and Blackblade Reforged to Sigarda. Currently without a haste enabler, she passes turn. Chris casts Stolen by the Fae on his own Glenelendra Liege. He creates 4 1/1 fairies. He then finishes off by recasting the Liege. Brian creates 10 black mana with Cabal Coffers, and then recast a Yara, pinging everyone for 1, while gaining 1 as it enters. He then casts his commander Izoni. As she enters, she creates 10 bugs, and then a Yara sees 11 creatures enter, and each opponent will lose 11 as he gains 11. He then casts a Dread Return, and brings back Craterhoof Behemoth. With Craterhoof CTB on the stack, Carissa Path to Exiles it. In response to Path, Brian sacrifices Craterhoof to Izoni to gain a life and draw a card. Chris gets a treasure, and Path loses all of its targets. Brian then funnels some souls into a Soul Ring. He flashes back Dread Return by sacrificing 3 insects, and brings Craterhoof back. With Craterhoof CTB on the stack again, Carissa casts an Enlightened Tutor. After the Tutor, Brian goes to combat and hits Carissa for 15. In main 2, he recasts Stinkweed Imp and pings everyone while gaining 1 as it enters. Caitlin doesn't pay for her draw. She drops a Swamp, and then plays a Mindslaver before passing. Carissa casts a Daybreak Coronet and moves to combat. She forgets to activate Rogue's Passage to make Sigarda unblockable, and swings her at Brian. Brian blocks with Stinkweed Imp, and Carissa gains 40 life. Chris casts an Elspeth Sun's Champion. He downticks her, and kills all creatures with power 4 or greater. In response, Brian sacrifices Craterhoof to High Market, and then Elspeth's ability resolves. Chris recasts Alela, and passes. Brian dredges back Stinkweed Imp. He then realizes he forgot to activate Genesis on his upkeep, most likely causing him to lose the game. He casts Sakura Tribe Elder, and sacrifices him to go and grab a tapped forest. He sacrifices Izoni to a Yara, and gives Chris a treasure as he draws. He then drops a Swamp for turn. He activates Cabal Coffers for 12 black mana, and recasts Izoni, creating 13 insects. As all the creatures hit, each of his opponents lose 14, as he gains 14. Chris is then eliminated. Brian recasts Stinkweed Imp, and triggers a Yara again. He loses a life, and sacrifices Stinkweed to activate Izoni's ability, and then dredges Stinkweed in place of the draw. He recasts Stinkweed, and pings himself to do the same again. He finishes off his turn by recasting Stinkweed. Caitlin casts a Mox Amber. She recasts Salvager of Ruins, and passes. Carissa recasts Sigarda. She enchants her with a Rancor, and then re-equips her before passing. Brian remembers to pay to return Craterhoof with Genesis's trigger on his upkeep, and cast Craterhoof for turn before swinging for lethal. Game review. It's a bit unfortunate Caitlin never was really able to catch up this game. I was very interested to see what she put together for Kethis. He's a commander I feel needs 1 or 2 more pieces to be really good, and I hope she's willing to come back in the future to play him again. Chris was doing great, and had an excess of mana on board with what may be the longest lasting Smothering Tithe I've ever seen. Unfortunately, he never hit a draw engine, and once he was hellbent, he stalled out. A Skull Clamp or Psy would have really come in handy this game. Carissa most likely should have won this game. She played excellently, and was constantly a threat with Sigarda. But forgetting to activate Rogue's Passage on turn 11 to make Sigarda unblockable ultimately led to her loss. At that point, she would have been able to eliminate Brian, and with Caitlin low on mana and Chris hellbent, she most likely would have walked away with a win. It's always a pleasure when a game makes me reevaluate a commander, and Brian's Izoni deck definitely did that for me this game. Golgari isn't exactly within my typical wheelhouse, so she kinda flew under my radar when Guilds of Ravnica was released. It was very interesting to see how she interacts with Dredge, and Ayara really makes this deck shine. Brian was able to pull recursive loops with Stinkweed and Ayara in order to dig through his deck and ultimately walk away with a win. As always, I want to thank the players for being a part of this game, and to give a shout out to Dungeon Games for allowing us to film. If you're in the Fort Myers area, feel free to drop by on Tuesdays or Saturdays when Devin records, and we'll see if we can't get you into one of these games. Please leave a like and a comment, and remember to subscribe to see more of our Commander content. And as always, thank you for watching.